The crystal stem slipped from Linda's fingers the instant her knees buckled. One moment she was laughing politely at a joke she didn't quite catch. The next, her body folded as if someone had pressed an unseen switch. The champagne fluted across my marble floor in a thin, elegant arc before the sound came glass shattering, a hollow thunk of skull to stone, and then Rebecca's scream tearing through the vaulted kitchen like a fire alarm. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. "Mom!" Rebecca shrieked, lunging forward in stilettos that skated on the spill. Daniel swore and dropped to his knees, palms splayed, his face already bleaching the color of printer paper. Guests froze in an ugly tableau, hands half raised, smiles half born, the new bartender standing motionless behind a row of bottles as if waiting for a director's cue. Even the winter rain outside the picture windows seemed to pause, the silver sheet lifting for breath. I didn't move at first. I was watching. Linda's jaw quivered. Foam began to feather the corners of her mouth. Her eyelids fluttered, rolling, as a fine tremor took her hands. I'd seen seizures before years ago. A junior analyst in my consulting firm had gone rigid mid-presentation, and this had that same terrible electricity, the body betraying its owner. But it wasn't surprise that pinned me still. It was recognition. 10 minutes earlier, I had watched my daughter-in-law pour a secret into a glass. Rebecca had posted herself at the champagne table with the efficiency of a maitre d'. Hair like a shampoo commercial, pearls like punctuation, she was performing warmth for 30 people who wanted to adore her and would have done so with the slightest encouragement. The flutes lined up on a mirrored tray caught the chandelier's light and flung it around the kitchen, my kitchen, the heart of a house I'd earned the hard way, deal by deal, after I buried my husband in a Portland cemetery and learned to sleep on just one side of the bed. She'd glanced over her shoulder the way a person does when they're deciding whether to trespass. Then, with emotion so small you might have missed it if you didn't specialize in noticing something I had learned in 70 years of living and 45 of surviving boardrooms, she palmed a tiny brown vial from her clutch. The dropper kissed a particular flute. Clear liquid met clear liquid. No color, no cloud. But I don't measure danger by color. I measure it by intent. It was my flute. I knew it instantly, the small, harmless chip on the rim I never threw away because I liked its honesty, the imperfect reminding me to be grateful. In that cracking second, speculation became certainty. The late-night comments about my overwork, the articles Daniel forwarded about downsizing homes after retirement, the way Rebecca had insisted on planning the party down to the monogrammed napkins, and that unsolicited private tour of a luxe senior community in Lake Oswego she'd sent me via text with too many heart emojis. I didn't gasp. I didn't slap the crystal from her hand. I learned long ago that a snake, once spotted, is best observed, let it believe it's alone in the grass. So when Rebecca glided over, palms soft around the flute, and said, "Elizabeth, you look tired. Let me top you off," I smiled the way I do when investors ask whether I'm worried about a downturn. "Sweet of you," I said, and lifted the glass. The cut edge grazed my lip. I could smell the yeasty bloom of good champagne and something else I wasn't imagining so much as remembering, bitter, green, the ghost of a garden gone wrong. Then a neighbor tugged at Rebecca's wrist to admire her new tennis bracelet, and the moment cracked open. Linda stood alone near the charcuterie, her purse swinging from her elbow, her eyes searching for a place to land. Linda, who apologizes when she breathes too loudly. Linda, who calls me dear, though I am 10 years her senior and the host, because deference is her native language. I set my flute next to her hand as if to free mine for a hug. She reached for it automatically, grateful to be included. 5 minutes later, she was on my floor. "Call 911, someone shouted. The bartender found a voice. Daniel's fingers fumbled for a pulse. Rebecca grabbed a linen napkin and tried to wedge it between her mother's teeth. Useless, dangerous, panicked. I pressed her wrist. "Don't," I said quietly, and crouched beside Linda, turning her onto her side, easing her head onto my folded blazer. Her breath was a fast metallic rattle, her skin, an odd damp chill. I counted silently, the habit of a mind that prefers data even when the heart is breaking. 1, 2, 3. Sirens layered themselves under the rain. In the seconds that followed compressions, questions, the brisk ballet of paramedics, I watched two faces. Rebecca's, glazed with a performance almost good enough to sell, and Daniel's, my son, who was always honest in his eyes no matter what his mouth attempted. What I saw there swallowed me whole, not shock alone, but calculation interrupted. A glance that pinged off Rebecca came back to me and then flickered with a fear I recognized from the mirror the night my husband died. The look of a person who just realized the plan has a variable. "Which hospital?" I asked the medic as they lifted the gurney. "Providence St. Vincent," she said. "Are you family?" "Closest thing she's got," I replied, stepping into a coat that felt like armor. Rebecca's nails grazed my forearm. "Elizabeth, maybe you should stay. Rest will handle." "No," I said. "I'll follow." Daniel tried a smile that once worked when he broke a lamp at 8 years old. "You shouldn't have to deal. I've dealt my whole life." I brushed past him. On the threshold, I turned once more. The tray of untouched flutes glittered. The chipped one was gone. The brown vial, of course, was not in sight. Outside, the rain resumed its steady applause, a curtain closing on Act 1. Driving west on Burnside, the city blurred. Food carts steaming under strings of bulbs, a man hauling a tarp over a bicycle, Powell's sign a soft neon pulse in the mist. I let the windshield wipers metronome my thoughts. If Linda lived, and I prayed she would, someone at St. Vincent would say the word I was waiting for: alkaloid, glycoside, extract. If she didn't, then tonight would become something else entirely. I tightened my grip on the wheel, felt the paper cut on my thumb from opening the party's caterer invoice that morning. Funny what stings remind you you're alive. I wasn't afraid, not exactly. Fear is what you feel when you're unprepared. I was something colder, the feeling you get when you finally see the board from above and realize the game has been going on longer than you allowed yourself to admit. At the red light by Washington Park, I spoke aloud to the empty car. "You picked the wrong old woman." If you've ever watched a celebration tilt into catastrophe, stay with me through the end of this story and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes the truth arrives in pieces, and tonight was only the first shard. The contract closed at 10:12 a.m. on a gray Oregon Tuesday, with a last flick of a stylus across a glass screen and a chorus of polite congratulations over speakerphone. $30 million. Numbers that once would have made me dizzy now sounded like the final measure of a long song, a crescendo, yes, but also a release. 28 employees whose mortgages would sleep easier. A product I'd shepherded from napkin sketch to acquisition. I powered down my laptop, stared at my hands for a moment, and felt something like quiet arrive. By 6 that evening, quiet had been banished. Daniel and Rebecca had insisted on the party. "Just family and a few of your people," my son had said, which in Daniel's speak meant anyone who had ever shaken my hand and owned a sport coat. The caterers came first, ferrying in copper chafing dishes and planks of alderwood heavy with cheeses and figs. Then the florist with blousy cream roses and eucalyptus that made the whole house smell like the world's most expensive apothecary. A string trio tuned up in the foyer, their notes testing the house's bones. And in the center of it all, Rebecca, suddenly reborn as the kind of woman who alphabetizes spice racks for sport. I watched her from the threshold of the kitchen, the place where I've always felt most myself between heat and movement, quietly orchestrating. Rebecca was everywhere at once. She corrected the bartender's pour. "More generous, darling, it's a celebration." Adjusted a place card so its serif font faced a particular way, asked the violinist to shift 2 feet left for better acoustics. This from a woman who, 3 Thanksgivings running, had asked if cranberry sauce came pre-sliced. "You shouldn't lift a finger, Elizabeth," she chirped when she spotted me. She air-kissed my cheek, her perfume bright and expensive. "Not after the year you've had. You built an empire in a hoodie. You're an icon." An icon. I smiled because I know how to be gracious, but the word clanged like a dropped pan. Rebecca isn't generous with praise, she's generous with comparison. Her compliments usually come wrapped in barbed wire. Tonight they were satin and sequins, excessive, oversweet, as if she'd learned them phonetically. I let myself be ushered to the living room where the fire turned the rain on the windows into liquid gold. Guests arrived in Portland black with pops of something celebratory: emerald earrings, a silk tie. Old colleagues slapped my back and told the story of the early days, the coffee-fueled sprints and near misses. A neighbor brought a lemon tart and whispered conspiratorially that she'd seen my house in an architecture blog. The bartender asked if I wanted my usual one glass of champagne, nursed slowly, and before I could answer, Rebecca called. "Nothing less than the 2008, please. Tonight deserves oldest, rarest, best." "Since when do you know vintages?" Daniel teased, kissing her temple. He used to look at me that way when he was 6 and proud of tying his shoes. She dimpled. I Googled. The kitchen shimmered with meticulous abundance. Oysters cupped in their own private seas, a roast of beef polished to lacquer, a tower of macarons precarious as a promise. Rebecca floated between stations, refolding napkins no one had used, polishing glasses that already shone. The performance was flawless, almost. "Your blouse is stunning," she cooed to my former CFO's wife. "Silk charmeuse, it drapes like liquid." Then, pivoting to me without a breath, "Elizabeth, if anyone ever deserved to retire early, it's you. I mean, 70 is the new 50, right?" A laugh that waited for permission to be funny. "You can finally relax." The word relax snagged at me. My spine did the smallest thing, straightened, then settled. I filed the sensation where I keep the details that save you later. A clause, a glance, a wrong tone. Daniel raised his glass and tapped it with a butter knife. "A toast," he announced, the room's hum dimming to a purr. His hair was damp from the mist, he hadn't bothered with gel, and for a moment I saw the boy who had once bent over a Lego spaceship as if it could carry him away. To my mother, who built something from nothing, who outworked the boys, who taught me that strategy is love in motion. To 30 million reasons to rest. Laughter, applause, a warm ache in my chest. To Elizabeth. We clinked and sipped. Rebecca slid to my elbow with a fresh flute before mine was half gone, her nails a candid, glossy red. "You know," she said, voice low, intimate. "I told Daniel last week, I just don't know how she keeps up with that big old house. It must be exhausting." She tilted the champagne, letting bubbles kiss the rim. "Don't worry, we'll make sure you never have to worry about anything again." "Funny," I said lightly. "I've spent 50 years making sure of the same." Her smile widened, but something tightened at the corners. "Exactly. Time to let someone take care of you." Another guest materialized, my head of engineering's husband, with news about a puppy, and the moment dissolved, but a thread had been tugged. I looked around with a strategist's eyes. The guest list tilted heavily toward people who'd seen me be formidable, not people who'd seen me be vulnerable. The music was just slightly too loud to encourage meandering conversations. People stayed where they were placed. The champagne table had been set up in a corner where the sightline could be easily blocked by a well-meaning guest or a strategic bouquet. The compliments kept coming, a glittering snowfall that never melted. "No one deserves this more. You can finally rest. You're so lucky. You're so blessed." Each one stuck to my skin and then slid off, leaving a film. I've always preferred the admiration. You don't hear numbers that climb, ideas that land, people who stay. Rebecca's praise felt like a salve meant to numb. Halfway through the evening, I found myself shoulder to shoulder with an old friend from our earliest days. "You look, what's the word?" she said, eyes crinkling. Not relieved, sharper. "Observant," I said, and she grinned. "Ah, the mind still making maps." I was making maps. Of Rebecca's circuits through the room, of Daniel's attempts to stand between me and certain conversations. "Mom, you don't have to talk shop tonight." Of the way Rebecca's hand hovered over my elbow in choreographed concern. She touched everyone, but she guided me. At the sink, a stack of crystal caught my eye. One flute had the faintest chip, a crescent moon of missing glass where lip met rim. My flute, the one I always pulled for myself because it felt like an honest partner, beautiful, but nicked, like me. I'd told no one about that chip. I'd simply kept using it because perfection bores me. Tonight it had been polished, placed, present. And later, when I saw Rebecca's fingers ghost a small brown vial from her clutch, when she angled her body between me and the room, when she blinked too slowly at her reflection in the window, that chip became a lighthouse in fog. Back in the living room, Daniel brought the conversation to grandchildren, to travel, to the luxury of time. "You'll love Tuscany in the fall," Rebecca breathed. "We can plan everything for you. You won't have to worry about a thing." I laughed, because in other circumstances it would have been sweet, but the echo of her earlier phrasing kept ringing. "You won't have to worry. We'll make sure. Time to let someone take care of you." Beneath the satin of her words, I could hear the scrape of a key trying a lock. Rebecca squeezed my arm again when the trio slid into a Sinatra standard. "Elizabeth, let me just say it one more time," she said, eyes bright, voice softened into what she thought tenderness sounded like. "I am so proud of you. You're an inspiration, truly." I looked at her for one quiet second, past the pearl studs and the lash extensions, past the excellent foundation and the dress she would return tomorrow for store credit, past even the fear that had begun to lick at the base of her skull like a hidden fire. I looked at the woman who had married my son, who had wanted glitter and security in equal measure, who was now playing a role that didn't fit her fingers, and I thought, this speech isn't for me, it's for the mirror. It's what you say when you need to hear yourself say it. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said. "That means a great deal." And it did mean something, not what she intended, but something more useful. It told me cleanly and without fuss that the evening had a second script running underneath the first. It told me where to listen. It told me where to stand when the music stopped. The chipped flute sat like a secret among its polished sisters, a crescent bite missing from the rim where the light caught and split. I'd always kept it for myself, habit, superstition, an inside joke with the part of me that prefers honest flaws to glossy perfection. Tonight it had been washed, buffed, staged at the far end of the champagne tableau, an invitation set in glass. Rebecca drifted toward it with the unstudied grace of a woman who has practiced in mirrors. She'd chosen a position that stole the sightline from most of the room, hip angled, shoulder turned so that only a narrow wedge could see what her hands were doing. I was in that wedge. So was the window, which reflected her movements with a traitor's loyalty. She glanced once left, right, and then the clutch in her palm loosened. A small amber vial slid into view, no label, a pharmacist's dropper glinting as if it, too, had something to say. The cork made the slightest kiss when it came free. 2-3 drops fell into the chipped flute, soundless, a fairy tale's measure of doom. She swirled the glass with a delicate wrist, the way we swirl to wake the bubbles, and smiled at nothing. Everything in me wanted to move, to step forward, take her arm, say Rebecca, no. To call for Daniel, for the bartender, for the police, for judgment, for God. But the part of me that has survived boardrooms and buyouts knows that the first reaction is often the wrong one, that a snake coils tighter when it feels the stick. So I did the most unnatural, disciplined thing I've ever done. I stood very still and let the moment pass over me like a cold wave. Observe, my mind ordered, record, decide. Rebecca's performance flowed on. She corked the vial, slipped it back into the clutch, and lifted the doctored glass with the reverence of a chalice bearer. She wove through guests with the soft apologies of a perfect hostess, and the house seemed to lean around her, helpful, complicit. She came toward me with that curated concern she wears like a cashmere wrap. "Elizabeth, you must be thirsty," she said, voice pitched to carry just enough. The flute offered upward, like a gift. My fingers touched the stem. The glass was cool, my face warm. Between us, the bubbles frothed like applause. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said, and took the flute not to drink, but to shepherd. While she preened under some neighbor's admiration of her centerpieces, I moved 2 steps to the left, as if drawn by the string trio's sweetening tempo. Then I breathed once, slow and complete, and put the glass down on the nearest flat surface, with the absent care of a woman who has placed 1,000 glasses in 1,000 conversations. A moment later, I moved it again. This is the part that will read like cruelty to anyone who hasn't had their life appraised by people they love. I set the flute near Linda, Linda Peterson, Rebecca's mother, stood alone at the edge of the room, an island in a sea she never quite learned to swim. She is a woman of lists and early bedtimes, perpetually overdressed by one notch, kind in the way that makes you feel guilty for not calling more. She had been watching the party like a child outside a bakery window, wishing she knew the names of the pastries. Her own glass sat empty on the mantel. When I put the chipped flute on the little console table beside her purse, it was as natural as straightening a frame. And then I stayed. I stayed within 10 feet. I stayed with my eyes on her hands. I stayed with my phone ready and my spine wired. I did not know what was in the vial. I did not know dose from fatality, minutes from hours. I knew only that Rebecca had chosen my glass because she was certain of my habits, and that certainty was a rope I could wrap around her wrist. Linda reached for the flute the way thirsty people reach for water pressed into their palms. She did not look at the chipped rim. Who would? She sipped, the bubbles bright in the hollow of her cheeks. She grimaced slightly. "Different," she murmured to no one. And then, because politeness is a sickness that afflicts certain generations of women, she sipped again. The party hummed on. Daniel laughed too loudly at something one of the engineers said. The roast was carved. Someone asked me about Tuscany, and I nodded, filed the sentence, "You'll love the truffles," into a drawer marked later. In the corner of my eye, Linda lifted the flute a third time, less certain now. She touched her throat with her free hand. When the first ripple crossed her face, it was tiny confusion knitting the brow, a blink that didn't quite complete. Her purse strap slid off her shoulder. The nearest guest reached automatically to save the bag. Linda's knees softened. The flute tipped. The chipped rim kissed the hardwood and did not break because fate prefers irony to theatrics. I was moving before the sound reached the room. By the time Rebecca turned, by the time Daniel registered the shift in the air and began to push through bodies, I was kneeling. Linda's breath came high and fast, then it stuttered. A thin string of foam gathered at one corner of her mouth. Her eyes tried to find an anchor and failed. Somewhere behind me, a woman screamed for someone to call 911. Somewhere to my left, the violin trailed off mid-phrase, the bow hanging in its own silence. "Linda," I said, and the calm in my voice surprised me. "Can you hear me?" Her fingers clawed for mine. I let her have them. Her pulse thrummed against my skin like a trapped thing. Rebecca arrived with all the right noises. "Mom, Mom, what's happening? Someone help, please." Her pitch slid up, perfect, almost perfect. But there is a note in true panic that cannot be faked. A crack that doesn't care how it sounds. Rebecca's voice had polish where it should have had tear. Daniel crouched opposite me, eyes wide, face chalk. What is it?" he panted. He looked at his wife because we all look at the person we trust to know what's next. I looked at Rebecca too. Her gaze flicked to the console table, the place where, minutes before, a chipped flute had waited like a lure. Empty now. Her pupils tightened to points. For a single unguarded beat, the mask lifted and something raw and feral flashed beneath. Then the performance slammed back into place so hard I could feel the whiplash radiate off her. "Is she choking?" someone asked. "No," I said, because I knew the shape of choking and this wasn't it. This was a body being told, chemically, to stop trusting itself. "She's breathing. Keep her on her side." I spoke to the room but kept my eyes on Rebecca as if eye contact could function like handcuffs. The dispatcher came through on speaker. The instructions were clean, kind, practiced. Keep her airway clear, note changes, any known allergies, any medications. Rebecca shook her head too hard, too fast. She takes vitamins sometimes, I don't. The rest of the sentence fell apart. Minutes stretch in emergencies. A house you've curated becomes a landscape you must cross. The front door suddenly seems very far away. Sirens in the distance are a promise you are afraid to test your faith against. I counted Linda's breaths because numbers are a rope. I counted the seconds between spasms because time is a kind of map. I counted the ways Rebecca could have believed this would go differently, because strategy is an old friend who sits beside you on the floor and squeezes your shoulder and says, "You're here now. Keep looking." When the paramedics shouldered through the door, the room parted around them like cloth. They were brisk and gentle and full of the competence that makes you love strangers. In the tangle of questions, I answered what I could answer neutrally. Age, symptoms, onset. No, she hadn't said it was her heart. Yes, she'd been fine an hour ago. Was there anything she could have ingested? "We had champagne," I said, and let the word hang. Rebecca made a small sound, almost a gasp, almost a protest, and then swallowed it. Daniel saw the swallow. I watched him watch her, and something like grief cracked open in my ribs. They loaded Linda onto the stretcher. Rebecca squeezed in beside, still performing devastation with almost award-worthy finesse. As they swung toward the door, she looked back, whether for me or for the console table, I couldn't say. The chipped flute sat upright where I had set it after it fell, a smudge of foam drying along the rim like proof. The house exhaled when they were gone, but the exhale wasn't relief. It was a draft, a shift in pressure before a storm. Guests murmured, scattered, fled. The string trio packed up with the mute efficiency of people who witness a thing and choose, kindly, to not make it part of their story. Daniel turned to me in the sudden quiet, his mouth opening and closing, a fish on a dock. "Mom," he said finally, voice hoarse. "What? What just happened?" I looked at him, at the boy who used to ask me how engines work, and at the man who had allowed himself to stop asking questions that mattered and smoothed my skirt with hands that did not tremble. "Something that wasn't meant to happen to her," I said, and let the sentence find its target without pointing. He followed my eyes to the console table, to the flute, to the hairline moon of missing glass. His face thinned, bloodless. I picked up the chipped glass by its stem, held it to the light, saw my own face waver in the curve. In the reflection over my shoulder, Rebecca's earlier posture replayed, perfect as a loop, a woman in a window stirring bubbles with a dropper and a prayer. I set the glass down again, precisely where it had been, and in that small, ordinary gesture, something in me hardened into decision. For a split second, the room made no sound at all, just the tinny clink of a spoon rolling off the counter and spinning like a coin on the marble. Then the party detonated. Someone screamed. Someone else knocked over a flute, the champagne fizz leaping like startled insects. Chairs scraped. The string playlist dissolved into a cheerful violin trill that didn't belong to this reality. Linda writhed on the floor, heel kicking against the baseboard, a string of foam webbing the corner of her mouth. Her eyes fluttered, whites flashing, and a terrible hiccuping breath shuddered through her chest. Elizabeth was already moving, knees cracking as she dropped beside her, turning Linda gently on her side the way the old Red Cross card had taught her. Pillows, airway, stay calm, keep the tongue from rolling back. Her hands were steady. Her mind was a ledger. What had gone in? Who had poured what? How long since the sip? "Call 911!" Rebecca shrieked, so loud the sound fractured. "Oh my God! Mom! Mom! Mom!" She clutched at air, at guests, at the edge of the kitchen island, her face wrenched into the perfect mask of terror. The acting was almost good, almost. Her gaze shot everywhere except to the champagne table, and when it did, she yanked it back as if the stemware might point and accuse her. Daniel barreled in from the patio, tie loosened, color gone. "What happened?" His voice cracked on the second word, convincing if you didn't know him. He knelt opposite Elizabeth, fumbling for a pulse at the wrong place, the heel of his hand pressing too hard on the soft dip of Linda's wrist. She just fell," Rebecca gasped, swaying as though the room tilted beneath her. "She said the champagne tasted funny. Oh God, what did she say? She said it was floral? Metallic?" The words tumbled out like pearls snipped from a necklace, rehearsed but meant to look unstrung. Elizabeth's eyes flicked up, catching at the look. A small thing, barely more than a heartbeat. Daniel and Rebecca found each other across Linda's shaking body, and something passed between them. Not shock, not grief, but a quickening, furtive comprehension. The kind of look people share when a plan has sprung a leak and they're plugging it with their fingers. It lasted less than a second, but long enough for Elizabeth to see the shape of it. Relief disguised as fear. Expectation bruised by surprise. "Ma'am," a neighbor Stacy from 3 doors down was on the phone with dispatch, voice tinny, efficient. "They're asking if she took anything, medications, allergies?" "Vitamins," Elizabeth answered automatically, because Linda's little plastic pill case was forever clicking at brunch. "No prescriptions that I know of." She kept her tone neutral, her gaze on Linda's breath, counting the interval between the jagged pulls. Her peripheral vision kept working, cataloging. Rebecca's hand shook, but not the way of someone who has lost control. It shook in increments, the tremor of a violinist hitting her mark on a difficult note. Daniel kept asking questions with too many words. How long? Who saw? Did anyone else drink from that bottle? Did anyone? And each question narrowed a corridor rather than opening one. "Is it her heart?" a guest murmured. "Sugar crash?" Maybe she stood too fast. Rebecca seized the opening, pressing a palm to her chest. "She hasn't been sleeping. She's been under so much stress with my..." She stopped herself mid-sentence, eyes widening as though she'd nearly said the quiet part loud. With life, you know how she gets." Another look, another quick, bright strike of understanding between husband and wife. Elizabeth watched it travel like a current. She felt a coolness spread beneath her breastbone, calm separated from cold by the thinnest membrane. Sirens. Faint at first, then swelling into the room like an inhalation. Air seemed to return to the guests. They stepped back, cleared a path, pressed napkins into their own hands like talismans. Elizabeth kept Linda stable, murmuring her name, letting her know the world was still here. When Linda's eyes found hers for half a second wet, bewildered Elizabeth saw the most painful honesty of the evening, a woman trying to say, "I didn't mean to take your drink." "It's going to be all right," Elizabeth said softly. She didn't know if it would be, but she knew she would make it so. The paramedics swept in with competent speed, voices low and clipped, wrists banded with gauze, equipment humming. Questions fell like dominoes. What did she consume? How long ago? Any known conditions? Elizabeth answered, and where she didn't know, she said, "Let me check," and stood to move deliberately around her own kitchen, the one she had designed, the one she had paid for, her hand grazing the lip of the champagne table. Her fingertips paused on the stem of the chipped flute, still beaded with condensation, the faintest smear at the rim where Linda's lipstick had blushed the glass. Rebecca shadowed her like a panicked moon. "Sarah, where are you going? Stay with me, please, please." That last "please" was pure theater, a beat too late, a half-tone too sweet. Elizabeth turned and held her daughter-in-law's gaze. Rebecca's mascara was immaculate. Her pupils were wrong. "Rebecca," Elizabeth said, the name tasting like a coin. "Breathe." "I can't, my mother." A small sob, perfectly folded. Daniel's phone vibrated. He looked. The muscles in his jaw jumped. He silenced it. "How long since she drank?" the medic asked. 5 minutes, Elizabeth said, and then to Rebecca, "You were talking to Mrs. Kaminsky about your tennis bracelet, the one Daniel gave you for... what was it?" She let the question drift, as though distracted by concern. Rebecca blinked. "For our anniversary," she said, soft, a fraction too quick. A hook swallowed. Daniel's eyes slanted toward her, warning, and snapped back. As they lifted the stretcher, the night receded into a corridor, the trail of melted ice, the champagne bottle purling on the counter, the faint fragrance rising sweet bitter, like crushed leaves or laundry detergent that missed the rinse. Elizabeth almost smiled. Oleander? Foxglove? She didn't know yet. But the ghost of the scent slid along the back of her throat, familiar enough to file away. Plant alkaloids. Someone had done their homework. "We're taking her to Providence," the medic said. We'll stabilize and run talks." "I'll follow," Elizabeth replied. Daniel stepped into her path, gentle, son-like. "Mom, Liz, maybe you should stay. You've had a shock. We'll go. We'll call you from the ER." He said "will" like a shelter being offered, like the brights of a car in the rain. He forgot she had taught him to drive. "I'm coming," Elizabeth said, voice even as a level. She addressed the medic. "I'm a close friend. They'll let me in." Rebecca touched Elizabeth's sleeve, a soft pressure that wanted to be control. "Please, let us handle this. You need rest." There it was again, the choreography, the careful steering of the target away from the evidence, away from the hospital, away from any room that might convert suspicion into data. Elizabeth noticed something else now that her senses had sharpened. Rebecca kept her purse zipped and pressed to her body, fingers flexing over the clasp as if it might sing. The small vial would be gone, of course, but hands remember, and minds forget to erase the way panic moves through the body like muscle memory. Guests began to file out in murmuring clusters, throwing backward glances that promised casseroles and concern later. The house dimmed, party light falling into the strange hush that follows catastrophe. Elizabeth took her keys from the bowl by the back door. She felt older than her 70 years and younger than them, both at once. She felt alive with purpose. Grief had been a tide. This was a current. On the porch, the air carried cedar and wet pavement. A siren flared across the neighborhood, then thinned. Elizabeth glanced at the kitchen window and saw their reflection framed in glass. Rebecca too close, Daniel too watchful, Elizabeth between them like the figure in a triptych. Something hard and useful settled inside her, the way a stone settles when the pocket finally finds it. This was not a mistake, not a moment of clumsy negligence, not a faulty cork or a bad batch. This was a script, and they had rehearsed their lines, the shriek, the tremor, the suggestion that Elizabeth should stay home, safe, docile, uninvolved. They had not planned for Linda to drink the wrong glass. They had not planned for Elizabeth to see. She clicked the fob. Her car woke with a soft blink. "I'll meet you there," she said, and walked into the night as if entering a familiar boardroom, the kind where battles aren't won by volume but by memory, by patience, by the exquisite, surgical pleasure of letting your opponent believe you didn't notice the knife they just slid under the table. Elizabeth noticed, and for the first time since the corks popped, she allowed herself a private truth. She wasn't frightened, she was furious, and fury, in the right hands, is simply another word for focus. Hospitals always smell the same: antiseptic, recycled air, the faintest trace of cafeteria coffee gone stale. As Elizabeth stepped through the sliding doors of Providence Medical Center, she inhaled it like a signature. A place where people arrive one way and leave another, sometimes stronger, sometimes not at all. Linda was already somewhere inside, wheeled through with a paramedic team whose faces had been carved into composure. Elizabeth followed their path through the gleaming corridor, heels tapping with quiet defiance. Rebecca trailed beside her, mascara intact despite the sobbing performance. Daniel moved just behind, a hand on his wife's shoulder, posture taut, as if holding up not her, but himself. In the waiting room, time rearranged itself into elastic silence. The television blared a muted news broadcast about city council zoning debates, absurd in its normalcy. Rebecca paced, shoes clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm so sharp it could have been percussion. Every few minutes she dabbed her eyes with a tissue and whispered, "Poor Mom, poor Mom," as though reminding herself of her assigned role. Elizabeth sat still. She folded her coat across her lap, spine upright, face composed. On the surface, she looked like any 70-year-old woman rattled by calamity. Inside, she counted Rebecca's steps, 3 across the tiles, turn, 3 back, turn, like a metronome, but 1 wound too tightly. A doctor finally approached, middle-aged, glasses slipping down his nose, clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He looked directly at Rebecca, then Daniel, before settling on Elizabeth as though instinctively recognizing who in the room would understand him without embellishment. "Mrs. Peterson is stable for now," he said. We're admitting her overnight for observation. She presented with acute poisoning. Tests suggest a plant alkaloid, a rare one, not something you encounter accidentally." The words dropped like stones into water, rippling outward. Rebecca's gasp was picture perfect, hand to chest, mouth forming an O. "Poisoning? That's impossible. She doesn't take anything. She's so careful with her diet." "Poisoning doesn't necessarily mean intentional," the doctor interrupted gently. "It means she ingested something toxic. We'll run a toxicology panel to identify the exact compound. In the meantime, we'll keep her hydrated and monitor her vitals. With luck, she'll make a full recovery." Daniel leaned forward. "But how could this happen at a party? Could it have been food poisoning?" "Not likely," the doctor replied. "The symptoms don't match foodborne bacteria. They're consistent with a specific compound, possibly derived from a poisonous plant. Whoever administered it did their research." Rebecca's pacing faltered, her heel missing its usual rhythm. She recovered quickly. "So you're saying someone poisoned my mother at Elizabeth's retirement party?" She turned, eyes wide, performing outrage. "Who would do such a thing?" Elizabeth met her gaze and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that concealed more than it revealed. "You already know," she thought. The doctor left them with instructions about hydration and rest. Rebecca sank into a chair, finally still, tissue pressed to her lips. Daniel rubbed his temples, exhaling hard. "Mom," he said, lowering his voice as though confiding in her. "You've been through a shock. Maybe you shouldn't be alone in that big house right now." Elizabeth tilted her head. "Alone?" He nodded quickly, seizing the momentum. "Yes. After tonight, after what happened to Linda, I'd feel better if you came to stay with us. Just for a while. We can keep an eye on you. Make sure you're safe." There it was, the invitation wrapped in tenderness, but with iron bars hidden underneath. Rebecca chimed in, leaning forward with both hands clasped. "Yes, Elizabeth. Please. It would put our minds at ease. You've been working so hard for so long. Let us take care of you for once." "Take care." The phrase struck her again, brittle as glass. Elizabeth studied their faces. Daniel's genuine worry smeared with something else, something darker. Rebecca's perfectly arranged, a mask that fit too snugly. And then it came, quick as a knife between ribs, that glance, that fraction of a second exchange between husband and wife, sharp as Morse code. This wasn't about Linda anymore. She folded her coat tighter, her voice even, calm, steel wrapped in velvet. "That's kind of you, Daniel. But my home is where I belong. I'll be fine." Daniel frowned, ready to argue, but she raised a hand. "I've lived alone for years. I've survived boardrooms, competitors, markets collapsing. If my safety depends on moving in with my son and his wife, then I'm already defeated. Don't you think?" Rebecca's smile wavered. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a line ready. Elizabeth rose, smoothing her skirt. "I'll visit Linda in the morning." She glanced deliberately at Rebecca's pristine tissue, then at Daniel's furrowed brow. "Get some rest. You both look exhausted." In the car, she sat for a long moment before starting the engine. Her reflection stared back from the windshield, eyes sharp, jaw set. Tonight, there had been no accident. Linda's collapse was collateral damage, a misfire in a larger plot. And Elizabeth Carter understood, with a clarity that pierced bone, she was the true target. The house was too quiet when Elizabeth returned, the kind of quiet that presses against your skin, reminding you that laughter had been here hours ago, and now even the echoes have packed up and left. She set her keys in the familiar ceramic bowl by the door, a gift from Daniel when he was 13, its glaze uneven but beloved. Tonight, it rang hollow when the metal clinked inside. She moved through the rooms like a ghost visiting her own life. The chandeliers still wore the residue of champagne light. Half-filled glasses stood abandoned on side tables, little monuments to conversations cut short. The couch smelled faintly of expensive perfume, Rebecca's brand, cloying and insistent. Elizabeth paused in the kitchen, her eyes landing on the chipped flute. Someone, probably a guest, had moved it onto the counter after the chaos. It stood alone, as if waiting for her verdict. She touched it with 2 fingers, not in sentiment but in recognition. This was no accident. This was evidence. Upstairs in her study, Elizabeth pulled the curtains wide. Portland's rain fell in silvery streaks against the glass, the city blinking beyond in tired yellow lights. She sank into her leather chair, her body aching, but her mind sharper than it had been in years. Sleep was impossible. She had too much arithmetic to do, not numbers on a balance sheet this time, but moral sums, emotional calculations. 40 years of work had built her here. 40 years of boardrooms where men twice her size leaned across tables, trying to crowd her voice out. 40 years of handshakes that carried hidden knives. She had outlasted them all, and she had done it while raising Daniel, carrying the grief of widowhood after her husband died too soon, teaching her son that love meant showing up, providing, sacrificing. And now that son had married a woman who looked at her like a bank vault waiting to be cracked. Worse, Daniel had followed. Not blindly, no. Elizabeth could see the deliberation in his choices, but willingly, seduced by comfort, by the promise of ease after years of struggle. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling where shadows pooled like ink. They lived beyond their means. She had known it. Of course, everyone did. The luxury cars, the oversized house in West Hills, the constant flow of designer clothes and glittering jewelry. Rebecca paraded on social media. Daniel's construction company had faltered after the recession, and no amount of charm could fill the contracts that never came. Elizabeth whispered into the quiet, "They've been drowning for years, and I've been bailing water for them." She thought of the loans that had never been repaid, the tuition checks she wrote without question, the down payment she provided when Rebecca wept about wanting the right neighborhood to raise their daughter. Little gifts that had stacked into a monument of entitlement. Now entitlement had curdled into desperation. Desperation into calculation. Calculation into poison. Her reflection in the dark window stared back, older but unbowed. Wrinkles carved by effort, not surrender. "You survived worse," she told herself. "And you'll survive this too." The betrayal hurt, there was no denying that. Daniel had once run through this very hall with construction paper crowns and plastic swords, declaring himself her protector. Now he was her threat. That reversal stung more deeply than Rebecca's venom ever could. But pain, Elizabeth knew, could be repurposed. In business, in life, in survival, it became fuel if you let it. She stood, pacing the length of the study, her slippers whispering against the rug. She began to assemble the pieces, not as a grieving mother, but as a strategist. Daniel and Rebecca had debts they couldn't climb out of. They wanted access to her money. They wanted control, guardianship, authority. The champagne glass had been their shortcut, a failed one. "They won't try again the same way," she murmured. "They'll change tactics. Subtle. Paperwork. The law." Pressure disguised as love. She opened the desk drawer, pulling out her old fountain pen, the one she'd signed every contract with. She held it like a weapon, twirling it once in her fingers. "Not this time. Not with me." Her voice grew steady, sharper. "I will not be their victim. Not in this house. Not in this life I built." The words vibrated in the air, a vow heavier than steel. Elizabeth turned back to the window. The rain had slowed, street lamps haloing each drop like small blessings. Somewhere in the city, Rebecca was probably still practicing her wide-eyed innocence in a mirror. Somewhere, Daniel was convincing himself that everything he did was for Mom's own good. But here, in her home, Elizabeth Carter was sharpening. She had seen the blueprint of their plan, and tomorrow she would begin drafting her counterattack. If you're still here listening, it tells me you're drawn to stories of resilience, the kind that remind us we're never too old to fight back. Don't forget to like this video, it helps us share more stories with people who might need them. Elizabeth extinguished the lamp, letting the room fall into darkness. The long night stretched ahead, but it no longer frightened her. It was not the darkness of defeat, it was the darkness before dawn. The morning after Linda's collapse, Elizabeth's home felt too pristine, as if someone had staged it for photographs. Every surface gleamed from the hurried cleanup, but beneath the polish lingered that faint, metallic perfume from the poisoned glass, clinging like a ghost. Elizabeth brewed her coffee, black and strong, and waited. She knew they would come. People who attempt murder rarely let time breathe. Urgency is their accomplice. By 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Through the camera feed on her new security system, she saw them. Daniel, shoulders hunched in feigned concern, and Rebecca, posture taut like a violin string pulled too tight. They carried a briefcase, which told Elizabeth more than any expression could. Plans had already been drawn. "Mom," Daniel said when she opened the door, "we brought breakfast." A white box of pastries dangled from his hand, her favorite bakery. The gesture should have been sweet. Today it was strategy. Elizabeth stepped aside. "Come in." They made themselves comfortable in the living room, the briefcase balanced on the coffee table between them like a third presence. Rebecca reached for Elizabeth's hand, her nails immaculate. "Elizabeth, after what happened to my mother, we've been thinking about you, about your safety." "My safety," Elizabeth repeated softly, lowering herself into her armchair. "Yes," Daniel added quickly, sliding the pastries forward like a peace offering. "You live in this big house all alone. It's too much to manage, Mom. If something happened like last night, you might not get help in time." Rebecca leaned in, voice dripping with rehearsed tenderness. "That's why we found something wonderful. It's called Sunset Haven, a luxury retirement community. It's not a nursing home, it's like a resort. Golf courses, spas, cultural programs, 24-hour medical staff. You'd love it there." Elizabeth sipped her coffee, the bitter warmth steadying her. "And what would it cost to join this paradise?" Rebecca brightened, as though pleased the question had been asked. She flipped open the briefcase, revealing glossy brochures of smiling silver-haired couples playing tennis and laughing at wine tastings. "It's an all-inclusive entrance fee," she said smoothly. $500,000, but it covers housing, meals, care for life." Elizabeth turned a page of the brochure, studying the staged photographs. Everyone looked content, yes, but their eyes had the glazed quality of actors hitting their marks. $500,000 up front, she said, tone neutral. "And then what?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Well, to make everything official, the facility requires a power of attorney, someone they can coordinate with for financial and medical matters. I'd be the natural choice, Mom. It would just simplify things. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." There it was. The heart of the scheme finally said aloud. A signed piece of paper that would hand her entire life, her $30 million, her home, her freedom into their waiting hands. Elizabeth let silence stretch, an old tactic she had once used in negotiations. Let them sweat into the quiet. Rebecca shifted first, crossing and uncrossing her legs. Daniel rubbed his palms together, an old nervous habit. "Mom," he said at last, his voice breaking into earnestness. "Please, we only want what's best for you. This way, you'd never have to worry about anything again." Elizabeth's eyes softened. She reached across the table, laying her hand gently over Daniel's. "I know you think of me," she said. "And I'm grateful." She turned to Rebecca, who blinked with surprise at the unexpected kindness. "You've gone to such trouble. I'll consider it." Rebecca's relief was immediate, her shoulders dropping, her smile widening. "Oh, Elizabeth, you won't regret this. Truly, Sunset Haven will change your life." Inside, Elizabeth felt something entirely different. Her pulse didn't quicken, nor did fear prick at her skin. Instead, a cool clarity settled, sharp as cut glass. This was no invitation. It was a trap, and if she stepped wrong, she'd be buried alive in it. But traps, Elizabeth knew, could be reversed. She picked up the brochure again, letting her eyes rest on the staged gardens and happy residents. "It does sound tempting," she murmured. "Perhaps you're right. Perhaps it's time I let someone else take care of me." Rebecca's hand clasped Daniel's, the victory almost too obvious. Elizabeth smiled back, perfectly serene. She had just given them what they wanted most, the illusion of control. What they didn't know was that the pen she would use to sign their papers had always been hers, and she had no intention of surrendering her life's work to a pair of desperate thieves. If you've ever felt pressured into choices that didn't feel right, you know the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. You'll never miss the next twist. Elizabeth set her empty coffee cup down with a gentle click. "Bring me the forms tomorrow," she said, her voice steady. "We'll go through everything together." Inwardly, she thought, "And tomorrow, the game will begin on my terms." Elizabeth didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling beams of her Portland mansion, the moonlight cutting sharp angles across the room. Images kept circling in her mind: Rebecca's triumphant smile, Daniel's trembling hands, the glossy brochures of Sunset Haven. They thought she was an aging woman ready to be herded into a gilded cage, but Elizabeth Carter hadn't built a $30 million empire by surrendering to predators. She had learned, painfully, that the moment you let someone else hold the pen to your life, they'd write you out of it. At dawn, she made her decision. The time for waiting was over. By mid-morning, Elizabeth was in downtown Portland, her driver dropping her off in front of a glass tower that gleamed like a blade. Inside, the elevator carried her to the 18th floor, where Robert Hayes had his office. Robert had been her lawyer for nearly 2 decades. He was a precise man, his silver hair always combed immaculately, his glasses perched low on his nose. He'd seen Elizabeth through acquisitions, mergers, lawsuits, and her husband's death. If anyone could help her now, it was him. He greeted her warmly. "Elizabeth, retirement looks good on you. Though, judging by the look in your eyes, you didn't come here to discuss gardening." Elizabeth gave a tight smile. "No, Robert. I came to talk about survival." Inside his office, with its wall of law books and the faint smell of leather, Elizabeth told him everything. The retirement party, the poisoned champagne, Linda collapsing, Rebecca's theatrics, Daniel's rehearsed concern, and finally, the Sunset Haven scheme with its obscene $500,000 entrance fee and the power of attorney papers. Robert didn't interrupt. He took notes, occasionally glancing up with that measured lawyer's gaze. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "They've escalated from manipulation to attempted murder," he said plainly. "That's not desperation, that's strategy. Which means you need 2 things: evidence and a counter-strategy." Elizabeth exhaled slowly. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Afraid? Elizabeth, you should be relieved. You're not powerless. You're forewarned, and forewarned means you have the advantage." His words steadied her. For the first time since Linda hit the floor, Elizabeth felt her pulse calm. "What do you suggest?" she asked. Robert pulled out a fresh legal pad. "First, documentation. Every detail you've told me, will put it on record. Second, financial defense. Right now, they assume your assets are within their reach. We'll make sure they're not." He adjusted his glasses. "How do you feel about rewriting your will?" Elizabeth's mouth curled into something that was almost a smile. "What did you have in mind?" Robert outlined the plan with the patience of a general preparing for war. The bulk of her estate, nearly $20 million, would be diverted into a charitable foundation for education and elder advocacy. Another portion would be earmarked for medical research. "And Daniel?" she asked. Robert's tone was crisp. "He can receive a modest annual allowance from a trust. Enough to live comfortably, but never enough to fund recklessness." "And Rebecca?" Robert's pen didn't hesitate. "Nothing, not a dime. You owe her nothing, and frankly, the court would find it reasonable under the circumstances." Elizabeth sat back, the weight of it settling on her. She imagined Daniel's face when he learned the empire he'd been circling was beyond his grasp. She imagined Rebecca's manicured fingers clawing through empty air. A flicker of doubt surfaced. This was still her son. But then she remembered his words, spoken so smoothly across her breakfast table. "Mom, at your age, anything could happen." Yes, Anything could happen, especially to people who underestimated her. Robert leaned forward. Elizabeth, this isn't just about protecting your assets. It's about reclaiming your narrative. They think you're passive prey. But if we play this right, they'll discover you're the hunter. Something hardened in her chest. For weeks she had felt cornered, like her life was being whittled down by invisible hands. But here, in this office, she felt the tide turning. "Draw up the papers," she said. Her voice was steady, commanding, the voice that had once silenced boardrooms. "Tonight, I want a new will, new trusts, new directives. By tomorrow, my son and his wife will be locked out of everything." Robert nodded with approval. "I'll have them ready by sundown." When Elizabeth left the office, the gray Portland sky seemed a little brighter. She walked with purpose, her heels striking the marble lobby floor like drumbeats. For the first time since Rebecca uncapped that vial, Elizabeth felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She was no longer reacting, she was building. And as the glass doors slid open, she knew one thing with absolute clarity: the game had changed. She was not the victim in this story, she was the architect. If this moment of resilience speaks to you, don't forget to subscribe. Stories like this remind us that even when others plot against us, we have the power to fight back. And if you've ever faced betrayal, share your story in the comments. You never know who might find strength in your words. Elizabeth lifted her chin against the drizzle and thought, "Let them come. They have no idea what they're walking into." Elizabeth had always believed that real safety wasn't about luck, it was about preparation. For decades, she had run her company on that principle, anticipating problems before they became disasters. Now, as she stood inside the quiet halls of her Portland home, she realized the same principle applied to survival. Her enemies weren't corporate competitors or hostile investors this time. They were sitting at her dinner table, they were calling her mom, and they had already tried once to erase her. The first step was security. The very next morning, 3 men arrived in unmarked vans. They weren't salesmen from a generic home security firm. Robert Hayes had connected her to a company that specialized in protecting high-net-worth individuals. These men moved like professionals, efficient, discreet, purposeful. Elizabeth watched from her living room as they installed cameras in every corner, motion sensors on windows and doors, and a silent panic button system wired directly to the Portland Police Department. When the lead technician handed her the remote, he said, "Ma'am, if anything unusual happens, help will be here in less than 3 minutes." 3 minutes. For most people, that sounded short. For Elizabeth, it was an eternity compared to the 5 minutes it had taken Linda to collapse on her kitchen floor. The second step was information. That evening, Elizabeth sat in her study, the rain pattering softly against the window as she dialed an old number. Patricia Blake answered on the 3rd ring. Patricia wasn't just any private investigator. She had once been Elizabeth's quiet partner in several corporate battles, an expert at digging where others couldn't. "Elizabeth Carter," Patricia said warmly. "You don't usually call unless there's trouble." "There's trouble," Elizabeth replied simply. "And this time, it's family." She told Patricia everything: the poisoning attempt, the Sunset Haven trap, the sudden insistence on power of attorney. Patricia listened without judgment, only asking for names, dates, details. "Daniel and Rebecca," Elizabeth concluded, her voice low. "I need to know everything. Bank accounts, debts, loans, credit cards, every last corner they've tried to keep hidden." And Patricia digged deep. They're desperate, and desperation leaves trails. Patricia didn't hesitate. "Give me 48 hours. Those 48 hours felt like years. Elizabeth busied herself reviewing Robert's trust documents, checking her bank balances, and testing the new cameras. Every time a sensor light blinked, she thought of Rebecca's manicured hand tipping poison into crystal glass. By the second night, she was pacing. Her mind replayed Daniel's concerned face, his insistence that she couldn't manage alone. That phrase again. At your age, she clenched her fists. Age wasn't weakness. Age was armor. She had survived wars of commerce, nights of loneliness after her husband's death, the unrelenting grind of motherhood and leadership. Now she would survive her son's betrayal. On the third morning, Patricia called. "Elizabeth, you'd better sit down." Elizabeth was already sitting at her desk, pen poised above a notepad. "Tell me." "Your son and daughter-in-law are drowning in debt. They've refinanced their house 3 times. They owe more than $80,000 in credit cards. Daniel's construction business is bleeding money. Rebecca's boutique is a facade, losing thousands a month." Elizabeth wrote each fact carefully, her heart heavy but steady. None of it surprised her, but Patricia wasn't finished. "There's more. 6 months ago, Rebecca filed for a life insurance policy." Elizabeth's hand froze. "On me?" "Yes, a policy worth $750,000. Rebecca listed herself as the beneficiary. She claimed it was standard as your caregiver." Elizabeth closed her eyes, bile rising in her throat. A caregiver. That word tasted like ash. Patricia's voice softened. "This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. They've been planning for months, maybe longer. The poisoning wasn't desperation, it was part of a strategy." Elizabeth opened her eyes and stared at the reflection of her own face in the darkened window. The lines around her eyes, the silver threads in her hair, the features of a woman who had earned her years. And yet, to Daniel and Rebecca, she was just a ledger entry waiting to be closed. The truth pressed on her chest with crushing weight. For weeks she had tried to make sense of it. Had they acted in a moment of panic, driven by bills and bad luck? But now she knew. They hadn't stumbled into betrayal. They had drawn blueprints for it. This was no accident. It was architecture. Her son and his wife had looked at her life, her body, her independence, her hard-won fortune, and calculated how best to dismantle it. They thought her age made her easy prey. They thought her love made her blind. They were wrong. Elizabeth's voice was steel when she spoke into the phone. "Thank you, Patricia. Keep digging. But for now, I have enough." She hung up and sat in silence, the rain hammering harder against the glass. The pieces of the puzzle had snapped into place. There was no room left for doubt, no cracks for excuses. Her son and his wife had become her predators. And she would be their reckoning. If you're still here with me, don't forget to subscribe. It helps this community grow. And let me know in the comments, have you ever uncovered a painful truth about people you trusted? Your story might give strength to someone else tonight. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing with resolve. For the first time, she wasn't just defending herself. She was preparing to strike. The rain had slowed to a mist by late afternoon, leaving the garden outside Elizabeth's window draped in a silver sheen. She had almost grown used to the silence of her fortified house, the low hum of the security system, the faint buzz of the cameras turning like watchful eyes. But that day, a different sound unsettled her, the sharp chime of the doorbell. Elizabeth checked the monitor before opening the door. On her porch stood Linda Whitmore, Rebecca's mother. Her posture was unsteady, her pale face framed by damp strands of hair, and her hands clutched a small purse as if it were the only thing tethering her to the earth. Elizabeth's instinct bristled. After all, this was the woman who had almost been sacrificed on her kitchen floor. But something in Linda's eyes and exhausted clarity softened Elizabeth's suspicion. "Linda?" Elizabeth said carefully as she opened the door. "Elizabeth," Linda whispered. "I need to talk to you. Please." Inside, Elizabeth brewed tea, the ritual steadying them both. Linda sat on the edge of the armchair, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around the porcelain cup. She hadn't touched it yet. Perhaps she no longer trusted what she drank. Elizabeth understood that fear all too well. "I suppose Rebecca told you I was confused," Linda began. Her voice was hoarse, as though she'd been holding back truth for too long. "That I mixed my medications, that I made a mistake." Elizabeth nodded slowly. That's what she claimed. Linda's laugh was bitter and short. "I don't take medication. Not the kind that makes you collapse anyway. Vitamins, calcium, nothing else. And I remember the taste of that champagne. Bitter, metallic, like something scraped from a penny. Elizabeth's chest tightened. She had expected denial, perhaps even defense of her daughter, but this was different. This was confession. "You saw something, didn't you?" Elizabeth pressed gently. Linda's eyes brimmed with tears. "I did. I saw Rebecca hovering near the drinks table earlier. She had a little dropper bottle. I thought it was perfume or some herbal tonic, but when I asked, she snapped at me, told me to mind my own business, and then, later, I remember feeling dizzy. I remember reaching for the glass." Her voice cracked. "Elizabeth, I think my own daughter tried to poison you. And instead, it almost killed me." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock. Elizabeth studied Linda, the sag in her shoulders, the haunted look in her eyes. This was a woman grappling not just with betrayal, but with the unbearable weight of maternal love colliding with monstrous truth. "She has always been obsessed with money," Linda whispered. "Rebecca talks about it constantly. How unfair it is that you have so much, how much easier life would be if something happened to you. Last month, she even asked me if I thought you had updated your will. I told myself it was idle curiosity. Now I see it was something far darker." Elizabeth's throat tightened. She had felt alone for weeks, her every move shadowed by suspicion. But now she had something she hadn't dared hope for proof from within the enemy's circle. "You understand what this means?" Elizabeth said softly. "Your testimony could expose her. You saw her with the bottle. You know her intentions." Linda's lips trembled. "She's my daughter, but she's not the girl I raised. She's become something else. And after what happened, after lying in that hospital bed knowing I was seconds from death, I can't protect her anymore. Not if it means leaving you unprotected." Elizabeth reached across the table, her hand closing firmly over Linda's trembling fingers. For the first time since the poisoned glass, she felt a surge of solidarity. She wasn't just an old woman fighting shadows. She wasn't just a mother betrayed by her son. Now she had an ally, a witness, someone who had been hurt by the same hand. "You're not alone anymore, Elizabeth," Linda said, her voice steadier now. "I'll stand with you, whatever comes next." Elizabeth met her gaze, and in that moment, two mothers once connected only by strained family ties became bound by survival and truth. That night, after Linda left, Elizabeth sat in her study with the rain starting again against the windows. For weeks, she had carried the weight of suspicion by herself. It had been exhausting, like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands, but now she felt the first flicker of strength return. Daniel and Rebecca thought they had her cornered, that her voice would be dismissed as paranoia. But with Linda's testimony, their facade was crumbling. The enemy had made a fatal mistake. They had turned their cruelty on their own blood, and now that blood was ready to testify, Elizabeth allowed herself a rare, grim smile. For the first time since the party, the balance of power was shifting. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was preparing to win. If you've been following Elizabeth's journey, take a moment to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter, and I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered an ally in the most unexpected place? Share your thoughts below. Your story might resonate with someone who needs it. The morning broke gray and heavy, clouds hanging low over Portland like a warning. Elizabeth Carter stood in her living room, her hands resting calmly on the polished oak table where stacks of legal documents lay waiting. On the surface, it looked like she was about to surrender everything, her wealth, her freedom, her very independence. But beneath her stillness was the careful rhythm of a woman who had survived the corporate world, the betrayals of family, and now plotted her most important victory yet. Daniel and Rebecca arrived precisely at 9. They carried themselves with the sharp tension of predators who believed the hunt was nearly finished. Daniel wore a tailored suit, his tie pulled tight as though dressing the part of a dutiful son. Rebecca followed a step behind, radiant in a cream blouse and gold earrings, her smile polished to perfection. "Mother," Daniel said warmly, placing the briefcase on the table. "We're so glad you've come to your senses. This will make everything easier for all of us." Rebecca slid into the chair across from Elizabeth and opened the briefcase with reverence. Sunset Haven will be the perfect place for you. Peace, care, companionship. She placed a manicured hand over Elizabeth's, and you'll never have to worry about a thing again. Elizabeth's lips curved into a faint smile. How thoughtful of you both. Inside, her heart was steady. The plan was already in motion. For nearly an hour, the three of them moved through the paperwork. Rebecca read each clause aloud, her voice silky with false assurance. Daniel leaned forward, guiding his mother's pen toward each signature line. Elizabeth played her part perfectly. Pausing, hesitating, then finally pressing the pen to paper with the air of an elderly woman finally giving in. The stack of documents grew. Power of attorney. Financial disclosure. Sunset Haven admission contract. With each flourish of her pen, Daniel's shoulders relaxed and Rebecca's laughter grew brighter. By the time Elizabeth set down the pen for the final signature, they were practically glowing. Daniel exhaled a long breath, as though he had just secured their future. Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she closed the briefcase, locking it with a sharp click. "It's done," Rebecca whispered. "Finally done." Elizabeth poured champagne into 3 glasses, her movements deliberate. She handed them out, raising her own. "To family," she said smoothly. They clinked glasses, their faces flushed with triumph. And that was when the knock at the door came. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She moved with calm precision to open the door. On the porch stood Robert Hayes, her longtime lawyer, flanked by 2 police detectives. Their expressions were grave, professional, and determined. Daniel stiffened immediately, his glass halfway to his lips. "What's this?" he demanded. "Good morning," Robert said as he entered, his leather briefcase tucked under one arm. "We thought it best to conclude this matter with complete transparency." Rebecca's smile faltered. "What are you doing here? This is a private family matter." Detective Morrison, the taller of the 2 officers, spoke firmly. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, this is a criminal investigation. We'd like to discuss the results of the toxicology report from the hospital." The color drained from Rebecca's face. Daniel set down his glass with a thud. Elizabeth remained seated, her expression serene. She had been waiting for this moment. Detective Morrison opened a folder and laid out the report on the table. The champagne from the retirement party was tested. It contained oleander extract, a lethal poison. The glass most heavily contaminated was identified by witnesses as belonging to Mrs. Carter. Rebecca's voice cracked. "That's absurd. Why would anyone poison champagne at a party?" Robert Hayes leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Perhaps you should explain, Rebecca, why your fingerprints were found on the vial recovered from the scene. Or why you took out a $750,000 life insurance policy on Elizabeth 6 months ago, naming yourself as beneficiary." Rebecca's composure shattered. That's not true." But Daniel wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked on the detectives, horror dawning in his eyes. Detective Morrison's partner, Officer Lane, placed a small plastic evidence bag on the table. Inside, a phone screen glowed with messages. And then, there are these. Elizabeth's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the bitter confirmation of what she already knew. The texts scrolled across the screen. "Rebecca, did you talk to her about Sunset Haven?" Daniel, "Yes, she's resisting, but she'll give in." Rebecca, "She won't resist for long." "We'll make sure of that." Daniel, "What if she gets suspicious?" Rebecca, "Don't worry. By Sunday, she won't be in any position to object." The room went still. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. His voice came low and broken. "You told me this was just about helping her, about protecting her." Rebecca's eyes blazed with fury. "And you believed me? You pathetic fool." Detective Morrison stepped forward. "Rebecca Whitmore, you are under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy to commit fraud." Rebecca shrieked, lunging for the briefcase, but Officer Lane caught her wrist and twisted it behind her back. The metallic snap of handcuffs echoed through the room. Elizabeth watched the scene with a strange mixture of sorrow and vindication. There was no joy in watching a woman dragged away in disgrace, but there was power in knowing she had not been defeated. Daniel remained frozen, his face pale, his body rigid. He didn't resist as the detectives turned to him. "You'll need to come with us as well," Morrison said quietly. "The messages implicate you in the conspiracy." Daniel's eyes flicked toward his mother. For a fleeting second, Elizabeth saw not the man who had schemed against her, but the little boy who once clung to her hand on the way to school. The grief was almost unbearable. As they led her son and daughter-in-law away, Elizabeth stood in the silence of her home. The papers they had celebrated over still lay on the table, meaningless now. Robert placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You did exactly what needed to be done. You've protected yourself, Elizabeth, and your legacy." She nodded, though her throat ached. "At what cost, Robert? My family is gone." Robert's expression softened. "Family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it's defined by loyalty and by courage." Elizabeth turned toward the window, watching the patrol car disappear down the street. The storm clouds had begun to break, faint rays of sunlight piercing the gray. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to breathe. The final trap had been sprung. The predators had been caught, and she, an old woman they thought they could control, had proven herself far stronger than they ever imagined. Stories like this remind us that strength has no age limit. If you've been moved by Elizabeth's fight, stay with me until the end of her journey. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments, have you ever had to outsmart someone who underestimated you? Part 12. An open ending. The woman who would not bend. The courthouse smelled like varnish and paper, a clean, sterile scent that made everything feel inevitable. Elizabeth Carter sat in the second row, hands folded, watching justice arrive not with fireworks, but with the quiet gravity of a gavel's final tap. Rebecca stood when the sentence was read. 15 years. No parole for the first 8. The color drained from her face, yet she held her chin high, as if pride could still turn back time. Daniel didn't look at her. When his turn came, he received 3 years for conspiracy, reduced for cooperation and the absence of direct violence. He nodded once at the judge, then turned, uncertain, toward his mother. Elizabeth met her son's eyes. For the briefest moment, she saw the boy who had once brought her dandelions in a chipped jelly jar and called it a bouquet. But memory could not rewrite consequence. She lowered her gaze, not in punishment, but in acceptance. Some distances are measured not in miles, but in choices. Outside, the Portland sky was a clean winter blue. Reporters had gathered, microphones lifted like cattails in a windstorm. Elizabeth stood at the top of the courthouse steps, Robert Hayes at her side, and cleared her throat. "I will not speak about vengeance," she said calmly. "I will speak about safeguards. About how many older adults are pressured, manipulated, or erased inside their own homes by the people who should protect them. That ends where courage begins." That afternoon, she signed the founding documents for the Silver Shield Foundation. Seeded with $10 million from the sale of her company, it promised 3 simple things: a legal defense fund for seniors facing financial coercion, a rapid response hotline for suspected exploitation, and grants for community education. Church basements, neighborhood libraries, union halls, anywhere people gathered to learn and look out for each other. She insisted on one more program that made her board raise their brows. Small emergency stipends for elders who needed locks changed, security cameras installed, or a safe ride to a lawyer. Prevention, she told them, is sometimes a deadbolt and a bus fare. The calls began within a week. A retired nurse in Spokane whose grandson had borrowed her checks. A widower in Salem pressured to sign over his farm. A woman in Manchester, New Hampshire. "I saw your interview, Miss Carter. I thought I was alone." Elizabeth answered the first dozen herself, voice steady, pen scratching notes on a yellow pad. She never promised to fix what she could not, but she always promised this: "You are not invisible. We see you. We will stand with you." Meanwhile, life rearranged itself into a quieter symmetry. The house grew softer at the edges, the way homes do when they are tended without hurry. The study, once a war room of documents and contingency plans, returned to its first purpose, a studio flooded with light. Elizabeth set the easel beside the window, the one that framed her garden like a painting inside a painting. She began with small canvases, lemons in a bowl, the arch of a fern, the webwork of winter branches. Her hand trembled the first days, then steadied, as if the body remembers what the mind forgets. On Sundays, Helen came by with scones and stories. They spoke about books and the absurdity of aging, about Linda's physical therapy and the way sorrow changes shape but never quite leaves. Sometimes they said Rebecca's name out loud, sometimes they didn't. Grief, Elizabeth learned, is a room with many chairs. You sit where you can. She visited Daniel once, against Robert's counsel. The visitor's room was mustard yellow and too bright. He looked older, softer around the eyes, as if contrition had finally found a place to land. "Mom," he said, voice frayed, "I don't expect forgiveness." "I don't offer amnesia," she replied gently. "But I will not stop hoping you find your better self. That's the part of you I raised." He blinked hard. "What happens when I get out?" "You build a life you'd be proud to tell your daughter about," she said. "You work. You pay what you owe, to the world and to yourself. And if you want my company, you earn it." He nodded, a man given both a boundary and a bridge. Spring arrived as if it had been waiting just beyond the fence. The pears exploded into white confetti. The soil, dark and generous, gave back what winter had taken. Elizabeth woke early, carried coffee to the garden, and listened. Bees like small engines, a far-off train, her own breath settling into a rhythm that was neither forced nor fragile. Today, she told herself, the large canvas. She primed it in a wash the color of cream and sunlight, then drew the first confident line. A shoulder turned slightly away, the suggestion of a chin held high. She painted slowly, certain strokes and long pauses, letting the woman emerge the way a truth does, reluctant at first, then unmistakable. Hours slipped. She heard the mail slot clap, a neighbor's laugh, the wind snatching at the chimes. She mixed a yellow so bright it felt like courage and laid it across the canvas on the cheekbone, the collarbone, the curve of an open palm. In the paint, the woman glowed, not young, not flattered, not made smaller to be digestible, a face mapped by weather and awake to the weather still to come. When she finally stepped back, Elizabeth felt the prickle of tears, not from sadness, but from recognition. This was not a portrait of who she had been before betrayal. It was a portrait of who had stepped through betrayal and refused to wear it like a name tag. She titled it in pencil along the stretcher, "Woman in Sunlight." That evening, the board of Silver Shield met around her dining table. Laptops, tea mugs, a rustle of strategy. They reviewed case numbers, court dates, a pilot program with the state bar. A volunteer read a letter aloud, written in blue ink that looped like ribbon. "Dear Ms. Carter, I told my church group what my grandson did, and they believed me because I said your name. I thought shame would finish me. It did not. Thank you for the courage I borrowed until I grew my own. MP, age 82. The room went quiet. Someone touched Elizabeth's wrist. She nodded once as if to say, "Forward." When they left, dusk had folded itself into the garden, and the studio window was a rectangle of gold. Elizabeth carried the canvas outside and propped it on the patio chair facing the last light. The painted woman shimmered, not just from pigment, but from declaration. You could almost hear her say, "Here I am, still." Elizabeth sat, ankles crossed, a wool throw around her shoulders. The air held that low hum of the world getting ready to sleep. She thought about the neatness of criminal sentences and the messiness of human ones, about how healing is a kind of manual labor nobody applauds. She thought of Daniel's nod, of Helen's laugh, of the 100 names taped to the fridge people for whom Silver Shield had been a bridge over a sudden dark river. She did not think of herself as heroic. She thought of herself as stubborn in the correct direction. A breeze lifted the edges of the canvas, and the woman in sunlight seemed to breathe. Elizabeth smiled, small, private, the smile of someone who has finally chosen her own life without apology. The open ending was not a cliff, it was a road. Tomorrow there would be more calls, more filings, more gentle refusals to be erased. There would be coffee on the back steps and paint under her nails. There would be cards from strangers, and maybe one day, a cautious lunch with a son trying to learn the grammar of repair. For tonight there was this: a garden, a painting, a sky rinsed clean, and the truth she would carry into every room, chapel, hearing, and kitchen table for as long as her voice held. Old age is not helplessness. Family is not merely blood. Family is whoever stands between you and the storm. She rose, touched the canvas with the back of her fingers like a benediction, and carried the woman in sunlight inside. The house welcomed them both, the life she had defended, and the life she was still gloriously making. The story you've just heard is not only about betrayal, poison, and courtroom justice. At its heart, it is about something deeper: the refusal of one woman to bend under the weight of age, manipulation, and greed. Elizabeth's journey reminds us that resilience does not retire, that courage does not wither, and that even when the people closest to us betray our trust, we can still rise, rebuild, and reclaim our power. But perhaps what lingers most is not the downfall of Rebecca or Daniel, it is the sight of Elizabeth in her garden, painting woman in sunlight, a portrait not of defeat, but of survival. A reminder that the most powerful revenge is not bitterness or destruction, but transformation. To live well, to live fully, to live on your own terms, that is strength. Maybe you have faced something similar. Maybe you've watched greed fracture a family, or seen an older parent, friend, or neighbor silenced when their voice should have mattered most. Or maybe you've been underestimated, treated as if your best years were already behind you. If so, let Elizabeth's story remind you: age does not erase worth. Family is not defined by DNA, but by love, loyalty, and protection. And now I'd like to turn to you. Your story matters too. Each of us carries a chapter worth telling, a lesson worth sharing, a truth worth passing on. I invite you to write a piece of your story in the comments, whether it's a memory of resilience, a time you had to stand up for yourself, or simply a message of encouragement for others who might feel alone. You never know who might read your words and find strength in them. If this story spoke to you, I ask for your support in the simplest of ways. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you'll be the first to hear the next story we bring to life. Every click, every comment, every share keeps this community alive, a place where voices like Elizabeth's and yours are never forgotten. Because in the end, we are not just telling stories, we are building a circle of resilience, one voice at a time. And perhaps, when we look back years from now, we'll see that the real sunlight is not just in the paintings we leave behind, but in the courage we shared with one another,